Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another session of Working in UX Design. And we will be going live very, very soon, in just a few seconds. So I'm gonna go live on YouTube in five, four, three, two, and one. Okay, welcome to the show, and welcome to another episode of Working in UX Design. We have a very special guest today. Her name is Jocelyn Malan, and she is a very experienced product professional who has a very interesting origin story and origin background that we will share more about and ask her more about. She has been a product and design leader for 14 years, building strong teams and creating impact for consumers and businesses. And she has helped teams achieve strategic excellence across different stages of product, particularly the 0 to 1 stage, which we'll be deep diving in today. She was previously the CEO of a Series A breast cancer biotech company, which got acquired back in 2019, and also founded two organizations herself, a design firm based in New York City that's still in operations today, and has been the founding team of two other companies. Her expertise to translate customer insights into concepts and products is very well valued, and therefore she was also tasked to teach for Stanford Design School, D.school, and also be part of advisory board for different startups and organizations as well. And she is currently based in Singapore, and I managed to catch up with her a couple of months ago and thought it would be a good opportunity to have her share her experience from the Valley, as well as what she's actually currently building for her own startup, for her own products, and the lessons behind it. So today we'll be covering very much about the product discovery process, as well as how Gen AI, how research supports it, and how localization comes into play in helping us to achieve product market fit. Welcome to the show, Jocelyn.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
Excellent. So let's get started with a very interesting back history. I know you come from a finance background and you were previously in investment banking.
Uh, in asset management, close enough.
in, in
Same world.
asset
Yes.
management, in the same role. And that's really interesting. Like, why did you decide to switch from finance into product and design?
Great question. Well, I mean, honestly, I started my career because I was being a very typical sort of like Asian daughter, graduated business in business in my undergrad, and didn't know quite to do myself, and then ended up in finance. Worked there and actually ended up in asset management and then more in direct investing with the World Bank in Kenya. And when I was doing direct investments, I actually realized that I actually really enjoyed talking to the entrepreneur or to the team that I was investing in on the opposite side of the table. And I found myself really thinking to myself, wow, they have such an interesting role. There's so many different dynamics at play. I think finance is a very interesting role for many different reasons, but I found myself drawn to the actual building process. And so the arc of my career has been trying to get closer and closer to the building side of things. So from venture, I then transitioned into a strategy consulting and venture builder that's based out of New York called Incandescent. I was a principal there, and I actually ended up building out the venture function of the organization for about 5 years. Grew our portfolio, and then eventually stepped into one of our portfolio companies, which I think, Daylon, you mentioned earlier, was an early stage breast cancer diagnostic company. And then on the side, was doing design, founded a design company also based in New York, and then fully made the transition over into product design in my previous last role, which was part of the holding co, a design lab that was based out of San Francisco.
Well, thank you for giving us a really brief history of your career pivots and transition. Just wondering how does it feel like to be on the other side, as you said, like working on products now, also working on your own projects as an entrepreneur.
I think if there was a word to sum it up, it would probably be dynamic. I really love the dynamism of my day to day. There's just so many different things to think about. And that's something that I really enjoy. And then on top of that, being an entrepreneur and founding your own product also has like a different layer of dynamism where now you're not just thinking about product and design. I'm thinking about like what's the actual business? How do I actually market this? And there are just many more streams that I have to figure out on a day-to-day basis. I really enjoy that.
That's excellent. And I think one of the pivots that maybe you have to do is going from business school to actually having a sensitivity to design. But you've done it over a number of years, and also taught classes on design as well. So just wondering, how did you make that transition more gentle for yourself in order to do design work and be recognized as a design leader?
Yeah, great question. I think I would say firstly, if you have a passion for anything, that's what you would naturally spend your weekends and evenings on. So I think my transition over to design sort of like isn't quick by any means. I spent a lot of evenings and weekends for many years, studying design. I didn't formally go to school in design, sort of like as I mentioned before, but what I did do was like study it on my own time, did courses, spoke to a lot of folks, and then also more importantly, practice. I also think in the world of design, your easiest glide path in is probably going to be design research. Only because like they're very transferable skill sets from other areas that like, for example, in design research, being empathetic, being able to listen, being a good interviewer, being a good facilitator. All of those skill sets that I mentioned are probably things that you would have learned in another job setting. And so I think that was initially my transition in, I would say. And then from there, rounding out sort of like your skill set with much more technical things. So spending a lot of time in Figma, understanding interaction design, like studying UX laws, practicing them, like going to a website and auditing it and saying, why is this button positioned in this specific way, or why are the colors in this way? And I think over time you will find that practice and that learning will compound for yourself. And that's how sort of like I've done it like over the years.
Yeah, it sounds like a very long and laborious process, and I think that's also really, really great that you have the discipline and this and perhaps that interest that is sustained over a period of time to help you to make that transition. That for a lot of people who are trying to get into the design field, it might be also beneficial for them to consider being part of circles or groups or classes for them to embrace to learn the basics and foundations of design, and then after that, do what you do, right? Like improve that practice.
Mhm.
So you've been an instructor at the Stanford before in d.school. So you want to talk a little bit about your experiences? Stanford is d.school is widely recognized in the design space as one of the most progressive and forward-thinking institutions. So you spent about 6 years over there. So tell us a little bit more about your teaching experience and the peers you get to work with there.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, as an overall philosophy in life, I love teaching. I think that if you're able to teach something that you've learned, that is the ultimate way of actually testing one's knowledge. So I
Mm.
naturally seek out a lot of teaching um, positions. So at Stanford, I taught two different classes over multiple semesters, or multiple, yeah, years. The first one was around much more of a practice in the nonprofit world. So I also have very passionate in the social impact space. So I taught a class sort of like around how do you jump aboard a moving train and start designing things when projects are already in motion. So how do you get up to speed really quickly? How do you actually understand the system and the context behind what you're thinking about, and to get up to date? So I did that. And then the second class I taught was around connection design, which is a little bit different. It is around how do you actually intentionally design communities, networks, and make or connections, sort of like in general, and think about it as a way of saying, hey, like if I need to connect, if we just boil it down to a single essence, how do I connect with another person really quickly? What are ways of
Mm.
doing that? And how do I do that systematically at scale? So it was a really interesting class because I think it's a little bit different to, when we talk about design in the UX, UI land. This one's a little bit more of a conceptual, like systems thinking class, which applies the principles of design, but in a very different like lens.
Yeah, that sounds like two really interesting classes. Was there a particular insight or lesson that was very, very memorable that you would maybe want to share with our audience, or perhaps a feedback that students consistently gave you, hey, this thing that I learned from you really changed my life or the way I see things?
Yeah, I think it might be from the connection design class. I think one of the concepts that we taught is the concept of the continuous loop of an invitation. So when you're thinking about, so let's nerd out for a minute about connection design. So when you think about like how do you design connection at scale, one of the things that you have to think about is that people's ability to socialize or people's ability to engage has a limitation, sort of like naturally in life. You think about like, great, like there's only so many events that I can attend, there's only so many community things that I want to say yes to. And from a community organizer's standpoint, what you then need to understand is that how are there multiple forms of invitation that I can design for my community to plug into at the different levels of energies that they're at. So for example, Curious Core, right? Like this event in itself that we're having a conversation right now is an invitation for your community, for your students to say, hey, maybe you've already gone through one of our classes, maybe you've never gone through one of our classes, but this is a lightweight, spend an hour of us is an invitation that you've extended. Um, and then the question is like, how many times as Curious Core would you extend this invitation? Are you doing it monthly? Are you doing it sort of like bi-weekly? But then what other forms of invitation are there? Like, is there something that's like lighter touch, right? Like maybe it's like a 15-minute conversation. Is there something that's maybe in a very different format? Maybe let's all get lunch together, sort of like as a community. Or maybe this something very different. Let's go deep and really technical and like spend a whole day together nerding out about one very specific topic. I think the question is, if there is no invitation and if it's not being designed, then there's no way for someone to engage. And then making sure you design those invitations continuously, sort of like as a loop. Because if the expectation is, oh, once I put it out there, people are just gonna naturally self-organize, that doesn't actually happen. And we've studied sort of like many communities before. There is a natural sort of like ebb and flow of engagement, and it usually peaks when you have like in-person sort of like events and it ebbs sort of like over time and you need natural sort of like peaks sort of like of engagements. Anyway, so that was I think the most interesting thing because I think framing different types of engagement and also as a continuous way and thinking about it from a frequency standpoint, especially if you're really trying to build community, I think changed my perspective as well. And the students' perspective of like, oh, this is really interesting. Like I didn't think about how touch points can be designed in different ways.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And as a community builder, myself, I really relate to that. And you're right. Like everyone has a different energy level that they want to commit to in a community, and so do the organizers as well, right? So
Okay,
it can't always be the organizers that's giving like 100% commitment over a sustained period of time because people will
correct.
get tired.
Right.
as well.
Yeah.
So they also have to design mechanisms where some of this could happen automatically, right? Or in an automated fashion.
Hmm.
That's really, really interesting. And kind of wish I knew about this when I was running my design community back then for about 10 years, Creative Mornings.
Mm.
Um, so understanding that and kind of like reconciling some of these experiences to what you're doing or what you have done back at UNICEF as well. I think you were at UNICEF very briefly as a business model specialist
Hmm.
and Office of Innovation. So I think that sounds like a period of time where you sort of applied the things you learned in venture building, development into UNICEF. Can you talk a little bit more about that experience and how has it shaped the way you think about building products today? Yeah.
Good question. My UNICEF experience was very unique in that I I took it sort of like knowing that I was craving sort of like a little bit being back in the social impact sector. So I spent a year there, and I actually just also recently wrapped up another short engagement with them. So it's UNICEF's, comes in and out of my life. And I think the really interesting thing about UNICEF is that, or for anything sort of like in the nonprofit sector, is that it changes the feedback loop on the financing side. Because when you're designing products and services in the nonprofit world, where money may not necessarily be a primary driving factor or even cared about at all, um, then it clarifies a lot of. So when you think about product, right, there's like the triangle of desirability, feasibility, and viability. It places a lot more emphasis on the desirability component of the triangle. Like because it's whether a user wants your product at all. So for example, I just wrapped up engagement with them. I was working with UNICEF's gender team, and we were designing a digital product for women and girls in a humanitarian setting. So this digital product is meant to provide women and girls education about their bodies, periods, what it's like to grow up in women. And these are women and girls in refugee camps, humanitarian settings. They may not necessarily have formal education. And because it's also in a humanitarian setting, it completely like paying for a product like this is completely out of the picture. Like I didn't even need to think about it. Um, because it just simply sort of like wasn't on the table, sort of like as a factor to think about. So that means then the only thing that really mattered was the desirability and the feasibility of actually reaching these girls and women with our digital product in education about women, and making sure that the content is very desirable and making sure that technically that like we're making product choices that are like great less images because images take a long time to load. You're reaching someone in a refugee camp, they probably have less data. So you're going for like very easy text-based bullet points, maybe very simple illustrations, nothing that's like no video, definitely. So making those kind of choices, I think really changes the equation. And it also helped me realize like how big of a difference when you add in the business modeling sort of like side of it, like the actual financing side, changes a lot of the incentives and the way that products are being built.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a very valid consideration. Once had a very brief opportunity to work on an app in Bangladesh, and some of the things that you mentioned were exactly the things that we were thinking about. Although I believe they back in Bangladesh and Dhaka and in some of the even suburban areas, they probably have better internet connection than the refugee camps themselves. So knowing that and the kind of products that you're building today, like I'm really interested to hear what are you working on these days, that you might want to share with the audience and walk us through your process. Like how did you come up with the idea? How did you, like test it? How do you kind of like how do you do your own product discovery, so to speak?
Yeah, sure. Happy to share two things that I'm working on right now. So right this year I'm on a creative sabbatical. So I'm taking the time to explore things that I really care about. So the first product, I would call it a fun product, something that like I don't know if I would ever have done it sort of like in my professional career. So something that a lot of you since I haven't met sort of like a lot of you. I mean, I'm a big K-pop lover. And so I decided that I wanted to create a K-pop lyric translation and Korean language learning app using Korean lyrics for myself. And feel like there's a gap in the market. If like meaning there are lots of, don't get me wrong, there are lots of language learning apps out there. There are lots of Korean sort of like lyrics that are out there in the world. But the missing point that I feel like doesn't exist is that if you are specific K-pop, you want to learn a very specific K-pop lyrics. So, for example, Blackpink is touring this year. I want to learn lyrics to this specific song. How do I learn it and flashcard myself so I'm able to then like sing it in concert? It's a very specific use case for myself. But then I thought to myself, now we get into the product discovery process. If I have this problem, wouldn't other people want to learn Korean K-pop lyrics? Why not? And so I ended up actually writing out sort of like a product roadmap for myself. So firstly, I sat down and said, great, like this product, my target market, who is it for? It's probably for people who are at the intersection of loving K-pop, wanting to learn sort of like Korean languages. So that's very clear in terms of an intersection. And also at a certain threshold where they're motivated enough to actually want to spend, concerts would be my main hook, right? So you want to learn a set list and who have the discretionary income to go to a concert and spend. So it's a very specific slice, let's say, of the market. And then what I did actually, because I started on this project this year, I actually used AI quite extensively, sort of like in my product discovery process. So my stack essentially was chat PRD to V0 to Cursor. And that actually worked really well just because chat PRD sort of like really just helped me hone a lot of the features that I was looking at, like asking like, what's the job that I'm trying to solve for? What is the user really interested in? And then, oh, sorry. And then for this platform for user research, I didn't use any of the traditional user testing D-Scout, Lisna platforms, which is usually part of my user testing stack. But instead, this was more word of mouth. So I actually found a lot of uh, like-minded folks in the K-pop world, which you can also find a lot of online forums for. And I organically got folks and also got introduced via friends, and even went back to test sort of like several different things. Got an initial wireframe up in Figma. Oh, sorry, I guess Figma should also be part of my stack. I always use Figma. Got Figma to do my work, to do wireframing, V0 to help sort of like refine it a little bit more. Surprisingly, I actually found that because my vision for the platform was a little bit out of the norm of usual UX interactions, V0 actually couldn't quite map to the flows that I wanted. So I ended up actually just mapping it on my own. Prototyped it really quickly, did a couple of different rounds, and got really great feedback. People loved it because it fit a very specific niche and fit a very specific fan group. So that was my product discovery process. And I think what I personally found, and that actually took me maybe about a month-ish to iterate, find folks, come up, do about 3 rounds of testing, and it was just me as solo, which I would say was almost night and day in terms of my ability to do that solo, because in a previous world, I would have spent so much time in Figma land trying to come up with these prototypes, that to do 3 rounds of user testing in that time frame would have been really, really hard. So anyways, that's project one. And then the second project, which I just embarked on, is something that's a lot nearer and dearer to my heart, and also in a field I've worked on for many years, which is the world of elder care. I'm still very early, sort of like in the product discovery process. But and also because I have a lot of historical knowledge from the 4 years that I've worked in elder care and in the care economy. And so I think my product discovery process is a little bit different than the K-pop one. Although with any product discovery process, I always start with user testing. So I'm actually in the middle of my first foundational round of user testing this week for my elder care app.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing like your personal projects with us. And it's really interesting to hear, as a fellow practitioner and professional myself, um, how you have a really, really clear job to be done. Doesn't matter like how many people actually are in that segment for a job to be done, but it's so clear and it's so specific that users actually, as you said, has shared with you feedback and that they love the product and are obsessed about it. How do you think that helps you get closer to product market fit, right? Assuming you're going to launch it, right? Maybe in a couple of months' time, once you
Right.
figure out the kinks. Yeah. How do you think this obsession with users and their passion for the product helps you with fit? Yeah.
Yeah. Great question. I'm actually gonna drop something in the chat for everyone. So I'm a very big believer. So there's this framework called your founding hypothesis, which is if you solve X problem for this customer with this approach, they would choose us over these competitors because of differentiator one and two. And this framework is from the folks who created the Google Sprint, Jake Knapp, and sorry, I forgot his Jake. There are two Jakes essentially.
Yeah. I,
Jake Knapp and John Zaratsky. I'm a very
mhm.
big fan of design sprint, the 5-day design sprint that they have created. And this framework is actually from their updated 2-day foundation sprint. And I love this because it just distills down like going into any sort of product discovery, you need to be so clear on what your ingoing hypothesis is. From this founding hypothesis, you then would create multiple sprints to test whether is the target customer correct? Is this approach correct? Is this differentiator correct? And is the other differentiator sort of like correct as well? It's basically a scorecard of even like it would be able to tell you whether you're running down the right path or not. And it gives you just like a really clear, like high level roadmap, essentially, to get to that product market fit. Because once you're able to check off, great, we got the right target, and like maybe you got the right problem, but maybe you're targeting the wrong customer. Or maybe you actually chose the wrong differentiator. So, for example, on my K-pop lyric learning app, which I'm calling Break It Down, by the way. So like we'll break it down. So maybe I have the right problem. Like maybe there's people who want to learn Korean and they're also interested in K-pop, but they don't have any sort of like solution out there. But then the customer base is totally wrong. Maybe it's not for concert goers at all. Maybe it's like the mom and a daughter parent, like the parent and kid pairing who are suddenly picking up Korean together. Or maybe it is actually men in K-pop because they have no communities online. I don't know, right? So it's like there are multiple ways you can actually use this to then test and say, great, like check. It's almost like a scorecard check off that you can have.
I really value the hypothesis approach to doing design. In fact, in all our courses, and especially the longer ones where we're doing career conversion and real projects, we try to advocate for people to come up with a hypothesis.
Yes.
I know like traditional design thinking is like, hey, let's go frame the problem and then like let's like kind of
Mhm.
like zoom in and then like discover solutions and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But I agree and echo with what you say because the hypothesis really captures your fundamental assumptions about the
Yep.
product, right? And if you can't solve these assumptions, you can't validate these assumptions, there are so much risk when you're launching it into the market. And the chance of you actually nailing product market fit or having a successful launch will be so much lesser in this case. So fully advocate for this approach. I didn't know the two gentlemen who invented design sprints have updated their material. So it's really great that you're sharing it with us. So just as a repetition for those who are listening on our podcast, if we solve problem for a specific customer with uh, X approach, they'll choose us over Z competitors because differentiator one and differentiator two. Could be more than two as well, right?
Yeah, it could
Yeah.
be more than two, right? Yeah. So,
Right.
for example, like the founding hypothesis for Gmail, right? If we
Mm.
help tech enthusiasts solve overflowing inbox with Google's data center power, they will choose it over Hotmail, Yahoo, Outlook, because our solution is searchable and high capacity.
Mm. Wow, that's really, really powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really great. And I think in our earlier and initial discussions, you mentioned that fit is a moving target. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Like, why do you say product market fit with the fit being a moving target?
Yeah. I mean, so I'm a big believer that you can get sort of like to product market fit, sort of like in a general sense, but it's always a little bit of a moving horizons because one, markets evolve, things can change dramatically. So, I mean, if with this current wave of AI, regulations could change, and just like completely change then the nature of how your product works. I also think that learning is cumulative, like meaning each iteration will help refine not just the product, but then the positioning, the pricing, the delivery. So imagine if like something, if a consumer packaged goods like never updated sort of like anything. Imagine if Slack never pushed sort of like any new updates or Google never updated their search algorithms. Like it would just be stuck in the past. Like meaning like, once you get to fit, you're just like in status mode. I also think the user expectations rise and change. What delighted to like users maybe 2 years ago, maybe now it's just table stakes and you have to continuously up the game. And I also think that feedback loops like compound, like meaning you have iterative cycles, you have tighter loops of learning, you have better tools. And I think the market evolution one, honestly, is one of the biggest ones, especially if you're working in a regulated market. So, for example, like so back in the US, I was working in the care economy, and the care economy meaning childcare, elder care, healthcare, in-home care. These are highly regulated markets, especially on the healthcare side. And in Singapore too, it's like a highly regulated market. You can't actually just like throw everything out and use people's data sort of like in different ways. When a new regulation comes out, administrative changes happen, like you have to keep up and you actually have to then say, great, what impact does this have on my product? And I will actually say like one of my very first angel investment that I had made was because of a regulation shift. It was a company called Concert Health. They're still going super strong, raised a Series C, amazing sort of like founders. And the reason why they came into existence was because there was a healthcare regulation change that enabled them to claim something, to claim payments for care coordination. And that unlocked a financing side of their business model that completely changed the game and they're doing super well. So things like, especially again, if you're in the regulated market, it really makes a massive difference.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And you're completely right. I think one of the things that we started observing is how search behaviors have been changing for users, right? So people are no longer just going to Google and searching for information. We're seeing like an increase in traffic of people that's coming from ChatGPT, for example, or even Gemini. So they no longer call it SEO anymore. They're saying like this is AEO, this is AI, sort of like optimization. And Google is concerned about this, right? Because that's an existential threat to Google
Absolutely.
search, which has been dominant for the last decade or more. So you're right that fit is a moving target, and as product professionals, we should continuously see where our customer attitudes and behaviors are changing. Um, And also regulatory wise, there might be some changes in the markets that we could either take advantage of, or if we don't, then get left behind in this case. So let's talk about like sort of like from a very macro perspective or big picture perspective of the product discovery process. I know you described briefly how you work on your own personal project doing product discovery, but in a professional capacity, you have something quite different, right? Because you naturally you have more resources. It's not just you as one person working on the product discovery process, and at the same time, there might be other factors involved. There might be other stakeholders involved as well. So, I want to hear your perspective when working on a say a effective product discovery process in a professional setting. What sort of changes or how do you approach it?
Um, that's a really great question. Um, I think it probably boils down to a couple different things. One is in a in a product discovery process in a larger company, one of the most important things is everyone seeing the right problem and solving it in the right way. I think there's a famous quote that I think it's Albert Einstein that said, if I had 60 minutes to save the world, I'll spend 55 minutes of it defining the problem and 5 minutes with the solution. I'm a very big believer in like, are we even solving the right problem in the first place? So the first part of even product discovery is like, what is the actual problem that we're solving for? And this actually is a lot of like leadership meetings, a lot of facilitation, a lot of like mapping out of like, is this the right way of even spending our resources and time on? Because you could be solving for a very different sort of like thing if you're not aligned at the start. So I think that's one. Number two would be helping stakeholders, because at the end of the day, a lot of product work is about stakeholder alignment and helping sort of like teams see and more importantly, intellectualize and emotionally resonate with what users are saying. So what I personally like to do in the product discovery process is that I always start with user interviews just because that's always my starting point of like, okay, great. Once we agree on the problem, the next step is always like, let's set up user research. Especially if they're like larger media problems. I'm not setting up user research for every single small feature, but it's like for larger, we're talking about larger media problems. And for the larger sort of like problems that you're focusing on, the likelihood of an engineer being sort of like in a user sort of like research meeting or a senior executive or like the chief commercial officers being sort of like in a user meeting or the CEO even hearing directly from a user what their pain points are is very rare, especially if you're a company at scale. Um, and the more that you can get someone to be in that user research, hear directly from users itself, and have some emotional resonance to the problem, that goes so far in terms of actually then people being able to digest sort of like what information is coming at them. Another way I've done it is actually sort of like taking clips from research and putting it into a short video and showing it to folks. And that's also what I've done in the past. Um, and then the third is actually then intentionally designing sort of like a lot of loops. So I as a product person, I actually am a very design-led product individual. I always start from research and I always start with design. Because I believe, and this is a personal philosophy, that this solving for desirability to me comes number one, which is also a very ideal way of thinking, but I'm showing my background. And then you can always sort of like build in feasibility and viability, but like if we don't nail desirability first, I don't even want to talk sort of like about feasibility and viability, just and usability, sort of like that's all a little bit like downstream. All those are very important things to start layering in, but I always want to start, do users actually want this? And I think that's a really important sort of like, it's an interesting philosophy because I know sometimes there could be different reasons, like sales might come and say, hey, this is something that I want, or the board is coming in and saying, hey, why isn't your product sort of like going in this direction? But my answer to a lot of that is, are users asking for it? Because if they aren't, then in the long run, we're just really setting ourselves up to fail.
I think that's such interesting philosophy. I came from design school. I have a quite a slightly different background from you. I actually came from design school and studied business eventually. But I find that to be really interesting that you prioritize desirability first. And I meant that as with the greatest respect because I think products from Silicon Valley, there's like a certain emphasis on on sort of like designing for people and making sure that it's not just for one segment of people, right? It's actually it has a mass appeal. It's That's like a universal appeal to it. That's why so many social media apps and networks actually come from Silicon Valley, and so many global products that we use and install on our phones today are actually from the Valley itself. And believe this philosophy is also quite prevalent in the Valley, and particularly for a very famous company we all know, which is Apple. So I think that's something really admirable because here in Asia we're about feasibility, right? And viability first, like what works first. So I'm just wondering how do you reconcile that? How do you convince people like this thing called desirability? It's also kind of iffy if you want to sell it to a business-minded person. Like how do you persuade them, hey, this is worth pursuing, this is worth throwing more resources into so that we spend time to get this right? Yeah.
Great question. I mean, I think it ultimately always ladders up into what do we believe would either A, help us with growth, A, acquisition, B, help us with retention. It really comes down to those two North Star metrics. Um, and at the end of the day, if a business person is coming to me or a CEO is coming to me and saying, hey, like, I really want you to build this feature, like, let's have a conversation. Again, this goes back to like, what problem are we solving for? Are we solving this because it's a retention issue? Are we solving this because it's an acquisition issue? And like, in the long run, like, if users are not using it, you have a specific thesis in mind, let's test it. Like that's always my answer. It's like, let's test it. And testing it, if we throw it out there. And again, in the age of AI, where larger, if especially if it's a chunkier, larger piece of product where you can spin something up pretty quickly as a product person, and maybe sort of like even having some help a little bit from your design team, you can prove really quickly with hard data like, you don't have to go back and forth anymore. This is not like a me versus you sort of like argument. The results will speak for themselves like pretty quickly. And then, you can then make the choice on the other side saying, this is an interesting feature. We still want to build it, even though it may not necessarily have mass appeal, but maybe we're a B2B business and it's going to actually solve a retention problem for two of our biggest customers. And maybe it's only for those two customers, but they're a disproportionate amount of our income, and that's actually really important to the company. That's a perfectly sort of like reasonable argument. I think in product, you can expect a lot of expected tensions, right? Like healthy tensions that should always exist, right, between teams, because you can always say to in product like, that looks really great, but actually we need to focus on something else at the moment. And I think that's a perfectly sort of like acceptable answer.
Yeah, thank you for sharing details on that. And I want to get into semantics a little bit because
Sure.
you said let's build something people want.
Yeah.
What about something people need or something people would love to promote? Like, how are they like different levels of aspiration that we should aim for as product professionals? Like, should like like want like where does one stand? I'm kind of curious in your sort of like categorization of all these terms.
Hmm. That's an interesting question that I think how I think about it is I usually categorize it as needs because um okay, let's backtrack sort of like let's go back to design sort of like 101, right? So if you went to design school, like you learned like the basic scenario of like you're being shown an image of a guy sort of like who's like kind of late, kind of just waking up, and it's like, oh no, I'm late for class, or I'm late for school, and like the alarm clock sort of like next to his bed is like showing sort of like a oh, maybe it ran out of battery or something. In that scenario, his need is I need to wake up sort of like on time. Sort of like his want could be maybe I should be maybe it's not a battery-based alarm clock. Maybe it's like a automated sort of like coffee machine. Wants can change depending on the scenario, but the need of I want to get up early. It's not really a cool job to be done, but anyways, we pick the scenario. The need is still stands. I need to wake up early. So that's kind of how I think about it in that like wants sort of like stem from needs. Um, and to me, needs are very fundamental things that link into ultimately sort of like a job to be done. Like they're very
So,
foundational or sort of things.
am I right to say that in your definition of a need, that answers desirability? If we answer the need, the customer
Hmm.
need, then we fulfill the desirability factor of a product
Yeah.
in that trinity that you mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
that's a good way to put it. And thanks for clarifying that. And I think just really talking about like this concept of localization, because like in Southeast Asia here, we're in such a disparate market, different languages, different types of users,
Hmm.
different types of cultures over here. How do you approach localization in your professional work? I'm quite curious about that. What's your approach to that?
Great question. I think there are a couple of layers to this. So one, I think about localization as there's probably sort of like a layering thing. One is what the users actually sort of like experience. So this is, the simplest one is like language, right? Color sort of like changes. The second layer will be sort of like images, illustration, visualization. Um, and the third would be sort of like bigger UX flows that would change. Very rarely, I would say you would touch this third layer, sort of like of flows. So like meaning if you're going to, let's pick an example, Airbnb. It's very rare that Airbnb would completely change their checkout and searching sort of like for if you're searching from Vietnam versus if you're searching for Malaysia. But what does change sort of like is in the images side, sort of like, or in the language side. So then thinking about it now, I'm giving again design examples, but like, languages like Thai is a lot longer than languages like Mandarin, which is like a lot shorter, just purely in terms of characters. So now when you're designing sort of like padding, and visuals, you need to account for that, right? Like how does that then change in terms of how the layout sort of like of a site looks, and where everything sort of like stands. So that sort of like is something that I think is linked in sort of like translations, visuals, or like even images that are sort of like that are being shown, right? Maybe those change depending sort of like on the context of the country. So like for example, going back to that UNICEF example that I was using before, images that we would use for women and girls in Iran would be very different than images that we would use for women and girls in Venezuela. Just because you want to be able to A, sort of like resonate with the illustrations that are being shown to you, or even B, being shown in more like culturally sort of like appropriate clothing. So I would say those two would change. It's very rare that the UX in itself would change in terms of clickability, sort of like and flow. Obviously, there are language sort of like differences in terms of right to left, like depending on, if you're reading left to right versus right to left
Yeah.
for the. But again, that's more sort of like in the layout page. And with
Mm,
that, I think what's really important for localization is then to work with your engineers,
mm,
getting the input. Because if from a product standpoint, if I'm just like, okay, great, I need multiple email templates to go out sort of like in different languages at different points in time. That seems super easy to me. From an engineering standpoint, you're like, oh, I didn't build this in from the start. Now I have to go back, create some like a very different layout. It changes a lot of things, and that's where I think you have to really work very closely with engineering.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. And what I also kind of infer from what you just said is that it sounds like content designers who are primarily involved in the text as well as sort of like the imagery and the media elements of the app have quite a big role to
Yeah,
play in localization.
100%.
So that's what I got. And actually, I do also observe a lot of startups making. I don't know if you call this a mistake, but they would literally like just customize features for every single one of their big clients.
I will call
Yeah.
that mistake. I will call that death by a thousand cuts, and that, in my perspective, is not a great way to build product because in that way, I wouldn't call that localization. That's just like one-off
Mm,
customizations. Because again, as product folks, one of the biggest roles is like not to minimize the number of one-off customizations because each build is very expensive. So you always want to have like have
mm.
a higher ROI in terms of what you're scoping out.
Yeah, lovely. And we have a question from the audience from this gentleman named Daniel, and he say, earlier when you were talking about the process where you had to convince the business people, does it mean that you pair product design and business design and to convince your business sponsors? And I think for those of you who are not familiar with the term, business design. They're a hybrid of designers who actually understand the language of business and can speak business lingo. Yeah. So, what's your perspective on that? Yeah, and yeah, how do you approach this?
Yeah, I would pair whoever is the product person, whatever angle you feel like is strongest to make your argument, with the business designer or the product person to make your argument to a business sponsor. So for example, if the main blocker or the main sort of like hurdle is engineering, like bring an engineer with you. Like if your main hurdle is product design or interaction design, so like bring that designer with you. Um, and I would also say like going in with data and really sort of like understanding the implications of it again, but this is the work of product and business design to back
Mm,
up your arguments. And you could bring another person. I think that could be really helpful. Yeah, but it's contextual. It's based on the kind of argument that you're trying to make, if that makes any sense.
all right. Thank you for your question, Daniel. And I want to kind of wrap up this session, which has been really, really helpful because we touch a lot of areas on product discovery. Earlier you mentioned some of the tech stack that you're using right now, building your own products, which include Chat PRD, as well as Figma, as well as Cursor, and V0, all right, which are all rapid prototyping tools. So we have an influx of Gen AI tools today, right? And more are being built as we speak from some of the major companies and even startups that are disrupting this space. Just wondering from your perspective, like being in the product industry for so long, how has Gen AI evolved our process and our craft? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think I mentioned it before, right? That the very first part of a product role, which is the product discovery role, has changed completely for me. So like meaning before a disproportionate amount of time spent on stakeholder alignment, you will always have to get what problem are we solving for, sort of like, and what is our scope. So that will always sort of like be the same. But the process of like, what are we building? What do I think is the right features? What do I think sort of like is my ingoing hypothesis? Before in a product role, it would have been very hard to execute unless you had sort of like a designer or engineer with you, sort of like in the first part of the process to build a prototype. Now you can do that on your own. Like that entire system is now compressed into your role. You can do multiple iterations, get a quick sense of what the market or what your users are telling you, go back to stakeholders and align with them. Great, I think this is a much more refined position of what I think that we should build, and then bring in a lot more of the scoping with design, sort of like engineering. So it just gives you like the level of confidence, I would say, like going in is significantly higher, as well as that first initial discovery part is also very different to me.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. And there's a lot of sort of like pushback or concerns about this, where people are saying, "Hey, Gen AI, it's bringing too much convenience to this process, where people are even getting lazy, right? That they're getting AI personas instead of actually doing real user interviews. They they're sort of like eliminating designers in the process because, like, hey, like let's say Google Stitch can now do design or Cursor can now do design. I'm wondering what sort of your perspective as someone who's yeah, as a leader in this space, like what are your thoughts on that? Because there's a lot of noise and there's a lot of like talk about like, hey, let's aim for efficiency. Let's kind of like take shortcuts over here.
Yeah, I have two responses to that. One, I think AI accelerates prototyping, never outsource thinking. And I say it accelerates prototyping, but in the actual build component of it, maybe you're like, you know, 20, 30% faster. Um, but the role of designers or engineers are still there. So if you think about like an entire, if you are trying to push something and build something from like start to finish, if before it was like, okay, like let's say that we have a sprint sort of like scoped out for like 8 weeks, right? And maybe sort of like the initial prototyping part was maybe 4 weeks of that because it took really long. Now it can be compressed down into two. But your build time still is there. I mean, there are obviously tools like Cursor that help sort of like that help engineers, and there's Midjourney that helps like designers, but the build time still remains true. Like you can't sort of like completely outsource everything to AI. And I think people who haven't actually gone through full build cycles yet, and also working with a very multiple complex sort of like code base, like it's easy to push out like quick projects, like I'm trying to build sort of like something like spin up a quick landing page. Sure, okay, you can definitely do that sort of like in a day. You're trying to make a complex change to a, 50 flow sort of like UX system that has like multiple implications and that has like a built-out design system. Very, very different story. So I think that's sort of like, I think is the difference when folks are like, we're trying to make AI and make everything efficient and designers are no longer relevant. I don't think that's true at all. I also think that one of the most important roles is that, especially as product folks, to continue to keep your product sense. I don't think that AI should be running sort of like user interviews. I think replacing that is a complete mistake. Like, meaning the closer you are to knowing what people need, like the better your product sense is. And the more that you understand that, then you can find product market fit sort of like faster. It brings teams closer, like always bring your team sort of like closer to customers. So in that sense, like I think like folks who are outsourcing that discovery part and the interviews and the user testing part, I personally sort of like am uh would not advocate for that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And you use the word product sense. I often in my classes I use the word product intuition, which
Yeah.
is actually
Same thing. Yeah.
yeah, it's something you can't actually teach, right? Like it's
Right.
not like, hey, go for a lesson and then you learn it. But
Right.
it's something you acquire over time that you refine. It's kind of like design sense, right? Or
Mm.
in this case, like it took me a while to get it. Oh, this is what a beautiful design means, or what a beautiful design looks like.
Mhm.
So it does take a bit of iteration on that. But thanks for sharing that perspective. We have a question from the audience. I guess to rephrase the question from Kim, she says she recognizes this new way of working.
Mm.
Um, how do you see the role of a UX and UI designer evolving?
I feel like teams are blending a little bit more into each other. So, if product folks are sort of like really helping to support like user research, I also think that designers should also develop their own version of product sense. And I think we hear more and more of this term of like folks becoming a little bit more full stack, so like T-shaped people. So maybe you're a designer, but then um, with a depth of like in UX UI design, but then you have a T-shaped sort of like skill set where you also are able to communicate to engineers and you're also able to have a lot of product sense essentially. And I think we see that happening sort of like across teams because it creates sort of like faster collaboration with each other.
Yeah, I think that definitely echoes to what I'm seeing myself in the training space, where we often get called to train
Mm.
product design teams or even some junior product managers on sharpening their product intuition, or even using Gen AI to support the rapid prototyping process, or even just um, developing new skill sets and capabilities that help them to go to market, build and launch products, and validate their hypothesis for their products as well. So I definitely also see the convergence. But I hope personally, from my sense, I hope it's not like, hey, we're doing this to save money and to cut corners in this case,
Right.
because I think you and I have been in an industry long enough to know that when people start thinking like that, it's like you say, right? We shouldn't outsource the thinking. And when people start cutting corners, they're like, "Oh, you're introducing a lot of risk to those
Mhm.
projects." I'm wondering, like, do you have any parting thoughts or ending words from our session today? Yeah.
Ooh. Um, Yeah, I think my parting thoughts is like AI sort of like accelerates prototyping. Never outsource your thinking. And vibe coding makes a lot of realistic prototypes like really quickly, but start start with sketching sort of like solutions on paper. Think about your positioning, think about your messaging. The more intentionality you bring sort of like into your product, um, going faster in the beginning isn't necessarily going to be faster sort of like overall.
Okay. So I have a fun last question to ask you, because I think since we were talking about product market fit so much, and everyone has a different definition of what it is, I want to understand, what's your definition of product market fit? Yeah.
Oh man, Dale, that's a big question. Product market fit is when you have built something that users need and
Okay.
they're willing to use over and over again.
Okay. Wonderful. I think that's kind of a nice conclusion to our session today. And we've covered so much ground over here, Jocelyn, and I really appreciate that you spent time with us sharing your wisdom and your experience. I wish you all the best with your personal projects. Despite whatever challenges that they're in right now, and thank you so much for giving us clarity, right, as well as some of the frameworks that you're using as part of your work to help us refine our approach into building products. And I definitely hope you share more over time. What's maybe on LinkedIn? I'm not sure. What's the best way to reach out and connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn would be best.
Okay.
Let me just or Dylan, you might have it up already,
Yeah,
but
I do
yeah,
have it up. So
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
I can copy and paste. And for those of you who are our listeners, you can search for Jocelyn Ling Malan. So Lingmalan would be Jocelyn's surname. So that's something you can definitely find out. Um, another contribution and final thought from someone said, product market fit is when people are willing to pay for it.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's also true to a
Yes,
certain
in
extent.
the for-profit world, not
In a
necessarily in
for-profit world, not necessarily non-profit.
yeah.
Okay, excellent. I think really nice wrap up. Thank you everyone for being here today. And we weren't able to answer all your questions, but we'll maybe take one or two after the session itself. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you for our next session.